Good day, beautiful people, and welcome back to my podcast, Life Treasures and Golden Moments. This is Natalie Silva. Well, we're into spring, and the warmer weather is heading in our direction. It's so nice to be able to see all the beautiful flowers starting to bloom and the grass getting green again. So hopefully we're going to have a nice long spring, not too hot and not too cold, and everyone's doing well. This month I want to share some stories with you about the miracles of mysterious visitors. And it's been said, be not forgetful to entertain strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unaware. The first story I'd like to read for you today is authored by Laura Hatch. And the title of the story is Rescued from the Jaws of Death. I should be dead, plain and simple. There's no reason that I should still be alive, except for a miracle. I didn't deserve it. For some reason, God wanted me to live. My junior year of high school didn't begin with the sense of anticipation and excitement most 17-year-olds experience. In spite of being chosen homecoming princess and affirmed by my classmates as a popular student, I was battling depression and low self-esteem. Seattle's long winter days of limited daylight and seemingly non-stop parade of gray, drizzly days was causing me to feel claustrophobic. Even on those occasional days, when the skies are clear and the snow-capped mountains circle Seattle, I was unable to feel joy as I witnessed the beauty of God's creation. In retrospect, I can see that much of my emotional malaise was due to the disconnection between my faith and my choices. I was a card-carrying Christian, but you would have never known it by the choices that I made. Since turning 15, I dabbled in drugs after school and gotten drunk on weekends. My parents had no idea I was the party girl my friends could count on for a good time. Come Sunday mornings, I knew how to turn on the compliant charm and go through the religious motions. They had no idea I'd been date raped and was secretly drinking to cover the shame that I felt. They hadn't a clue I was losing my desire to live. The night of October 2nd, 2004, I was in bed by 8 o'clock. Even though it was a Saturday night, I didn't want to go anywhere. My twin sister and a friend from school barged into my room and flipped on the light. They told me they were headed off to a party and wanted me to go with them. I turned over and grunted, "Oh, no thanks." They insisted and started to pull me out of bed. Reluctantly, I pulled on a pair of faded jeans and a t-shirt. For the first time in a long time, I chose not to drink at the party. Nothing could numb the inner pain that burned like acid in my soul. I really didn't want to be there and proceeded to lock myself in a hall bathroom. With the music pulsating against the walls, I determined how I could leave the party without interrupting everybody's fun. Feigning a smile, I emerged from the bathroom and found my twin sister. I told her I was going home. Pretending I was headed for the kitchen where the food was, I sneaked out the front door and got a ride to where my sister had parked our 1992 Toyota. I turned the key in the ignition and peeled out of the driveway, turning in an opposite direction from the short road that led for home. I decided to just drive through the countryside and try to clear my head. There were so many thoughts colliding between my ears, I felt so dizzy. Taking a corner at a high rate of speed, my car flew off the road and down a steep embankment crowded with Douglas fir trees and blackberry bushes. The flight down the ravine took place in a slow motion. With eyes wide open, I was aware of everything. For some reason, I wasn't afraid. Whack! The car careened against a massive tree trunk. At once, life resumed to normal speed. A branch pierced the windshield and struck me in the face, even though I had buckled my seatbelt. I was thrown into the back seat and sandwiched between the crunched frame of the car. A stirring pain penetrated my body as I lost consciousness. What must have been several hours later, I came to my senses and I realized I was in real trouble. My eyes were nearly swollen shut from the impact, and my vision was limited to looking through tiny slits. I could feel blood all around me. The pain was so intense, I knew I must have broken bones throughout my bent body. I tried to push open the door, but it refused to budge. I was trapped. The thought dawned on me, unless someone finds me, I will die. Somehow, that inevitable destiny was okay. Life had not been worth living anyway. Meanwhile, I had no idea what was happening at home. When I had not returned in 24 hours, my parents reported my absence to the authorities. As they gathered information about where I had been the night before my disappearance and my troubled state of mind, they assumed I had run away. Convinced I didn't want to be found, the police failed to launch a full-fledged search. My family and my friends from school and church proceeded to look for me, but they didn't have much to go on, since I had not braked when I failed to navigate the curve. No skid marks had been left on the road, and there was no guardrail. After a few days, my mom reached the point where she assumed I was dead. Even every few hours I awoke from the perpetual sleep, the mask of the pain. Because I was only wearing a t-shirt and jeans, I was shivering and not able to fully relax. I tried to mark the number of days that passed by noting the darkness and light outside. On what seemed like the fourth day of my ordeal, I called out to God, "Oh Lord, I'm sorry for the mess I've made of my life. I've messed up really bad. Please let me die here and go to be with you, or rescue me." Amazingly, I heard God speak to me. They weren't audible words, but I knew exactly what he was saying. "You aren't going to die. I will rescue you because I want you to be my disciple, witnessing to my power around the world." 7 days after the accident, while I drifted in and out of consciousness, I was unaware that a friend, Beth Ann, and her mom, Shay, had been on an out-of-town state trip. Upon returning, both were shocked to learn of my disappearance. Fearing of my whereabouts and condition, they joined one of the informal searches efforts that by that time were losing momentum. While no evidence surfaced, Shay told Beth Ann that the only real hope they had to find me was to ask the Lord for help, and they both prayed. That night, Shay had a recurring dream about an intersection she knew well not far from her home, in addition to a visual image of the location. A voice in the dream implored Shay to keep going. The following morning was the 8th day I'd been trapped in my car, barely alive. Shay told Beth Ann about her word from the Lord, and the two proceeded to drive to the area pictured in the dream. Parking at the side of the road, Shay and her daughter got out. While Beth Ann remained near the car, her mom inched her way down the steep embankment. Her hopes of finding something that would point to me were dashed. There wasn't anything. Shay called back to Beth Ann that she couldn't see anything. When she indicated she was going to climb back up, Beth Ann called out, "No, keep going." It was the very phrase from the dream that Shay had not bothered to tell her daughter about. Taking it as a validation of the dream and the location, Shay persevered down the rugged ravine. Just beyond a thick patch of wild vegetation, Shay saw the mangled car. Looking in, she saw me in the vehicle, looking lifeless. Shay used her cell phone to call 911. Within minutes, medics and rescue personnel were scaling the cliff and evacuating me to safety. My parents were notified as I was transferred to the nearest hospital, where I was placed in the critical care unit. The doctors didn't know if I would survive. Although my mom and dad were extremely grateful that I had been found alive, They feared that I would never recover completely. 2 days later, it appeared my vital signs had stabilized and that I would live. What didn't seem likely, however, was that I would ever walk again. While hospitalized, I learned I had lost 40 pounds in those 8 days. The dramatic loss of weight was from not having anything to eat or drink for that entire time, and whereas people can go that length of time without food, it is unthinkable to go without water for that many days. Ironically, it was the deprivation of water that kept me alive. The doctors discovered a blood clot had developed on my brain as a result of the crash. The clot was prevented from growing by my lack of fluids. Had I drank any water, the clot would have expanded and put fatal pressure on my brain. Amazingly, the Lord spared me from certain death by preventing me from finding a bottle of water that was on the floorboard of the car. 2 months after being miraculously rescued, I went home to the bedroom in which this surrealistic adventure had begun. Within a few weeks, I was walking again. A year later, I had graduated from high school and enrolled in a Christian liberal arts university in suburban Seattle. I smiled as I recalled God's whisper in my heart while trapped at the bottom of the embankment. I want you to be my disciple, witnessing to my power around the world. I'm happy to say that it's already taking place. Wow, how blessed and lucky she was that her friends found her through God's messages. The next 2 stories that I'd like to share is under the heading of Waiting for a Miracle. And the first one that I'm going to share is called He's My Cat, Mom, and the author is Betty R. Graham. One Friday morning a few months ago, I had just walked into my office when the phone rang. I reached for it and heard my son's panicky voice. "Mom, you've got to come home quick. Bootsy's been hit by a car." I drove back home promptly, worried about Brian. His cat meant a lot to him. We rushed Bootsy to the Mount Vernon Animal Hospital and waited anxiously while the veterinarian's expert fingers gently probed the animal's limp body. Then she ordered x-rays. I knew the prognosis was bad when she called me aside in the hall. "I'm afraid that he doesn't have much of a chance," she whispered. I swallowed hard. "Well, do what is necessary, doctor. Don't let him suffer." I didn't know how I was going to tell my son. When we entered the examining room again, Brian turned his tear-stained face to the doctor. "He will get better, won't he?" 14-year-old boys aren't supposed to cry. I could see how he was struggling with his emotions and trying to act like a man, but the fear in his eyes belied his attempt at optimism. "We'll do what we can, son," Dr. Prescott answered. "I'll have to keep him here a while." "We can come to see him, can't we?" Brian asked eagerly. I never heard of visiting hours for cats, but the vet nodded. Did that mean that she wasn't going to put Bootsy out of her misery? I didn't ask. In the car, I tried to prepare Brian for the inevitable. We didn't seem to have much luck with pets. In the 4 years we had lived in Mount Vernon, Virginia, we had lost our little 10-year-old Yorkshire Terrier, Timmy, and 3 other cats. Brian would get over the loss of 1-year-old Bootsy, I told myself. After all, it was only a cat, not a very affectionate one at that. He would all but knock me down to get to his food bowl, but once his fat tummy was filled, he seemed to ignore me. I could stand on the front porch and call him again and again, and he would turn his back and go the other way. "We'll get another cat right away," I said to Brian. "But I don't want another one, Mom," he sobbed, giving into the worry inside of him. "I want Bootsy. He's my cat." Like every mother, I have times in my life when I wish I had the power to grant the impossible dreams of my children, even though I know that disappointments help youngsters build the character and maturity needed to face adult life. I find it harder to deal with my boys' pain than my own. At that moment, I would have given anything for a magic wand to wave over Buttsy. I wanted to be able to say, "Mommy fixed it, honey," as I had so often when Brian was growing up. We drove to school, and I explained to the principal why Brian was late, asking that the teachers be a little understanding that day if he didn't concentrate fully on his studies. Then I returned to my office and dug into normal duties. When I got home that afternoon, Brian met me at the door. "Can we go see Buttsy now?" he begged. "Not today, Brian," I answered. "Dr. Prescott said we should wait until after the weekend." I changed the subject and started to prepare dinner. I fixed Brian's favorite rice, and we played a game together after supper. But it was earlier than usual when Brian kissed me goodnight. "Butchie's got to be okay," he said. My heart ached for the child. I went to bed too, lying there trying to sleep. I heard sounds in Brian's bedroom, thinking that he was crying again. I quietly went to comfort him. Moonlight shone through the windows of his room, and peeping in, I could see Brian's dark silhouette. He was on his knees beside the bed, his hands folded, whispering a prayer. "And he never did anything bad to anybody. Please, God, I know you can do it." Aside from our daily grace at the table, I had not heard Brian speak aloud to God since the bedtime prayers we said together when he was so small. When he reached his teens, his faith became private. I tiptoed back into my room, feeling ashamed. Not once that day had I suggested that God might help. I call myself Christian, and I try to set an example for my children, yet I had not even thought of praying for a cat. But Brian had. And why shouldn't he? Didn't God create all life, and isn't it precious in his sight? If it were not so, why would he direct Noah to save the animals? I had looked at the odds and had given up immediately. But inside the heart of my loving son, there was a spark of hope, and the childlike wisdom to know where to go for help. I knelt quietly beside my own bed and joined Brian in his pension. On Monday morning, I called Dr. Prescott. The veterinarian said that wouldn't hurt if Brian came to visit his cat. "Butchie's still alive," she told me, "but he won't eat. His chances are even slimmer if he doesn't take some nourishment. He won't have enough strength to get well." Had the cat given up too? That afternoon, we went to the kennel in the area of the pet hospital. Dogs barked and cats meowed as we passed the metal cages. We found Buttsy stretched on his side, his eyes dull and glazed. His breathing labored. A portion of his fur had been clipped from one hip, where the car had struck him. The cat's broken pelvis and ribs would heal, the vet told us, but other internal injuries caused more serious problems. "Hey, Buttsy," Brian called softly. "How you doing, baby?" He gently stroked the sleek head of the cat, and his cat's tail twitched slightly. "You're going to get better soon, Butts. I know you are," Brian said confidently. "We love you." The cat could not lift his head, though he opened and closed his eyes occasionally during the 10 or 15 minutes Brian stroked him and talked to him. When he returned the next afternoon, Buttsy raised his head as Brian approached the cage, but his food remained untouched. Brian held the water bowl to Butsy's lips, and the cat lapped a few times. Then Brian picked up the food bowl and offered a few crumbs on his fingers. The cat licked them off. A soft buzzing sound, an erratic purr came from his throat. The following afternoon, Buttsy was curled in his normal ball when we opened the cage door. His green eyes, now clear and shining, looked up at my son with nothing less than adoration. The cat had eaten some of the food in his bowl, and with Brian's help, he'd finished his meal. My son's joy reached new bounds when Buttsy struggled to stand so that he could rub his cheek against Brian's hand. 4 more days went by before we were allowed to bring Buttsy home. He limped badly, and I thought he would be crippled for the remainder of his 9 lives. But today you'd never guess that the cat had been hurt. He's once again fat and sleek. He runs as fast and jumps as high as he ever did. The only difference I see in that cat is his undisguised devotion to my son. When Brian comes home, Butchie runs over, stands up on his now strong hind legs, and greets Brian with a kiss. My neighbor Pam expressed my own feelings on the day we brought Butchie home from the hospital. "It was love that saved that cat," she said. "Love can work miracles." Yes, it was love, the pure love of a young boy with faith, who cared enough to communicate his feelings to his pet. But more, it was the perfect love of God, who hears every sincere prayer. I had wished for a flimsy magic wand. My son reached out for the greatest power in the universe, the power of God and his love for all of us. Wow, another good story. As you know, I'm an animal lover, and that one really touched my heart. Thank you to our author on that story. The next story I'd like to share with you is called Angel on My Shoulder, and the author is Laura Powell. September 1996. It was past midnight, and I couldn't get Dad's roses off my mind. Why hadn't I watered them before I left? What if my father returned home before I got back? I had been staying at my parents' house taking care of 3 black affectionate cats and an acre of lush garden while my parents traveled from California to Missouri for a special reunion. Unexpectedly, I had been called back to my home a half-a-day travel. Now I'd been gone 3 days. Visions of drooping blooms and rose pinks, pale yellows, vibrant reds, and violets haunted me. More than likely, Dad would be arriving back tomorrow afternoon. What if I couldn't get back to his garden in time to water and refresh it? What if he found his prize flowers dead? Finally, at 2:30 in the morning, I got out of bed, dressed warmly. The summer nights had been cool, and headed for my Volvo. If I could get from my mountain cabin to my dad's house later that morning and soak the roses for an hour, surely the petals would be bright and cheerful by noon. It was especially important to me that nothing shadow my dad's homecoming, as I wanted to ask him for money to save my house. Without enough capital to make a $41,000 payment, I wouldn't be able to keep my cabin. My 3-story Granville model with enormous picture windows looked out over fir, pine, and cedar-covered Alps, and a silken bluish lake beneath me. I had a panoramic view all the way to the desert 50 miles beyond. Friends loved to gather at my home for barbecues and parties, and especially a front seat view of the 4th of July fireworks launched from the nearby lake. But now I was in danger of losing the only home I had ever owned. In just 60 hours, the payment was due. Would I be able to get the money in time? Dad had urged me to sell my house and move back home with him and Mom if things didn't work out financially for me. Yet even though he had never given me money as an adult, I had even put myself through college without his help. I knew that Dad would much rather have me independent and able to survive. All other avenues to find the lump sum needed to pay off the debt on my cabin had failed. What if Dad wouldn't help? My plan to drive back to Dad's house and water the roses seemed right, even though I was too tired to make the trip. And were the roads safe for a woman driving alone in the middle of the night? I would find out. I hadn't been in the car long before I became aware of someone seated directly behind me. I could feel a light weight on my shoulders and a feeling of safety as I drove in the black of the night down Interstate 15. Accompanied by the peaceful presence, the enormous fear about the roses and my approaching meeting with Dad lessened. The gentle presence I felt in my car calmed me. I had an angel on my shoulder. I gathered hope, like picking up kindling for a warm fire, that one way or another God was going to work things out for me. Arriving at my family's abode sometime in mid-morning, I took hoses and saturated not only the wilting roses, but the zucchini, tomato, the onions, and the carrot plants. Then I headed for the avocado, peach, and orange trees and drenched them as well. Next, I laid out sprinklers on the lawn, fed the cats, and headed to bed with a prayer that God would take care of the garden and make it glow with vitality in the short time left. I slept soundly. Then hours later I heard my parents drive up, a familiar honk identifying them. My dad was pleased with how his garden looked, glad that he had left the horticulture in my hands, exhilarated that he had been able to see so many friends on what he felt was his last trip to his hometown of St. Joseph, Missouri. But I also noticed how tired he looked, and decided to delay my conversation about finances as long as possible. The next day, remembering the supportive attention and the attendants in my car, I took strength and asked my father for a few minutes of his time. My voice shook slightly as I laid out my plight, mentioning the alternatives I had tried and my determination not to lose my home. Quietly, Dad listened. Would he be sympathetic? Would he want to help? Already my family had seen me through 2 emotionally trying years. I was flailing like a goose caught in a shifting wind, the wind current attempting to regain its composure and its flight plan. "Why don't you sell your home?" he at last offered. His voice was firm. My heart sank. My hopes were demolished by this one last question I couldn't answer. Wasn't I already afraid that I could not survive? But without my house, I didn't have faith to go on. Seeing my stress, Dad sat back in his chair. "When do you need the money?" he said, after a long pause. "Today," I fumbled. At last he seemed convinced that I needed my house. "All right," he said, "I'll write you a check." As he did, I thought again of the angel's presence in the car. Surely that same heavenly presence was helping me now. The other concerns came into focus. After receiving the check, I realized that I did not have time to drive home and deposit the money in my bank in time for it to clear. It usually took a week, so I could draw on it for the payment the following day. Why hadn't I thought of this before? I was so intent on obtaining the money I had failed to figure out how I would cash such a huge check in time to rescue my cabin. Now what? As I thanked my father, an idea began to form. Go to the local branch of my bank here, where my parents live, and deposit the check. Ask them to wire the money to my bank immediately so I could withdraw it the next day. When I got to the bank minutes before it was due to close, I realized that I was without an ID in my hasty departure from my cabin. I had not even taken my driver's license. The bank didn't know me, and the bank didn't know my father. Now what? I entered the bank and went directly to the bank manager. Quickly I explained my dilemma. The matronly woman looked for a moment at the piece of paper. "I see the check is considerable," she said, "but seeing you in your situation, I think we can get the money into your account by this evening." This woman had no knowledge whether my father's check was good. Even my last name was different than my father's. What proof did she have that I was telling the truth? She had no way of knowing if the check rightfully belonged to me. To my astonishment, she did not ask further questions or for proof of any kind. While she performed the transfer, I held my breath, and I prayed there would be no problem with the check. I was in a hurry to get out of there before she changed her mind, so I rose to leave. As I prepared to leave, I heard her say, "Just a minute." I looked at her, expecting the axe to fall at last. Instead, smiling pleasantly, she reached into the top drawer of her mahogany desk, pulled out a small object, and held it out to me. Receiving the token, I looked and saw a gold pin of an angel with the words "Angel on my shoulder" written at the bottom. I gasped. I knew right then, in a way I would never question again, that I had helped in saving my home. When circumstances were overwhelming, an angel had been sent to give me a hand. So you know that song, I believe there are angels among us. And the last story I'd like to share with you today has to do with believing in life's mysteries. And the title of the story is called Sign of the Dove. The author is Lisa Marie Bertheim. Two of my mother's closest friends, her cousins, Janie and Colleen Clary, were in a terrible accident in May of 1993. They had been driving through town when they were involved in a head-on collision. Janie died instantly, and Colleen was hospitalized with serious injuries. My mother had grown up with Clary girls, Clara, Charlene, Mary Jane, whom my mom called Janie, Marlene, and Colleen. Some of my best memories, she often told me, are of playing with these girls and pretending I was a Clary girl too. Although they were only cousins, they seemed to Mom like sisters. Aunt Peachy and Uncle Vern were Mom's godparents. She had stayed in touch with the Clary family her whole life and made sure her kids did also. We all took the news about Janie hard. As time went by, though, Mom's deep faith in God and in heaven and life after death seemed to help her accept what happened. Death doesn't sever the ties we have, Lisa Marie. She'd tell me, it just changes them until God sees fit to bring us together with our loved ones again. I believed in God and I believed in heaven, but I could not understand how that translated to people being able to stay connected after death. Mom would tell me, sometimes I can feel Janie's presence. She's here with me. How can you know that? I asked. Well, Janie loved those cherry ice drinks, she'd say. Sometimes I can smell one of them or even taste that sweetness. I found that to be more than a little strange, but Mom remained steadfast in her belief that Janie was still somehow present in our lives, not just in our memories. Meanwhile, Colleen recovered from her injuries, and in October of 1996 we celebrated her marriage to Mike Myers. I hadn't seen Mom that happy in a long time. She said the wedding was a sign of hope. All of us agreed. With the coming of spring, there was also the promise of new life. Colleen was pregnant. Then in the course of all the medical tests that had gone along with the pregnancy, Colleen found out she had leukemia. That even more tragically should befall the Clarys seemed unfair. Colleen's only option for treatment was a bone marrow transplant. Colleen and Mike decided to put off the treatment until after their child was born, and the doctors felt Colleen was strong enough for the grueling procedure. On October 2nd, 1997, Derek Vincent Myers came into the world, strong and healthy. Colleen's bone marrow transplant was scheduled for February of 1998. Shortly after New Year's, Colleen was admitted to the hospital in preparation for the transplant. Her immediate family was tested for bone marrow compatibility, and two of her sisters were perfect matches. Everyone had faith that Colleen would be okay, but it was my mother who believed most firmly of all. I've been getting visits, she told me, from a dove. I call it my peace dove. To her, the bird was a sign of Janie's presence, and a reassurance that everything would turn out all right for Colleen. I wasn't sure what to make of it. I never saw such a bird, and even if I had, I wouldn't have been convinced that it was a message from God. At the end of February, Mom told me she hadn't seen her dove for several days. Colleen had made it through surgery, but it was too early to tell what the final outcome would be. I'm worried, Mom confided. It might mean something's wrong with Colleen. It wasn't long after that we learned Colleen needed emergency surgery for an infected gallbladder. An infection of any sort of a recent bone marrow transplant recipient is cause for serious concern. We waited and we prayed. Mom thought Colleen would rebound. I saw the dove again, she told me, as excited and hopeful as she had been that day of Colleen and Mike's wedding. But Colleen's condition deteriorated rapidly, and she was put on life support. That's when Mom told me the peace dove had once again stopped appearing. She kept on praying, though. I wondered if our prayers had any power whatsoever. If God really heard us, why had he taken Janie? Why wasn't Colleen getting any better? Normally, I would have asked my mother because her faith seemed unshakable, but instead I kept my doubts to myself. I didn't want Mom to have to worry about me and my faith as well as Colleen. By the beginning of March, Mom told me, it's been so long since I've seen my peace dove. I'm not praying that it's coming back anymore. Instead, I'm praying that God will give Colleen peace and give the Clary strength. Did that mean making Colleen well or bringing her to heaven? I wasn't sure, and I still couldn't bring myself to ask. The day we learned the doctors could do nothing more for Colleen, my mother stood staring out the kitchen window. I think she was looking for her peace dove. This is so unfair, I said to her. Aunt Peachy and Uncle Vern already lost Janie. Now they're going to lose Colleen. How could God take her when she just got a little baby who needs her so much? Mom turned away from the window and looked at me in silence. After a long while, she sighed. Then she said, Lisa Marie, I'd like to think Colleen has made peace with whatever is in store for her. No matter what happens, she'll remain connected to the people she loves, just like Janie is. The very next morning, my mother was driving us down our street when she suddenly pulled over. Look, she said, peace doves. Right there on the side of the road were 2 doves. Maybe it was only because Mom had talked so much about her peace dove being a sign of Janie's continuing presence in our lives. But there wasn't a doubt in my mind that the 2 doves could only mean one thing. Colleen had gone to join her sister in heaven. My own eyes couldn't deceive me, and in any case I ever started to question what I'd seen on the roadside that day of Colleen's death, God made sure I came around to Mom's way of thinking. I have a snapshot that was not developed until after Colleen's funeral. It shows Colleen and her family before the deadly infection struck, when everyone was hopeful for recovery. At the top of the picture, almost directly above Colleen's head, there is a silhouette of a dove, proof to me that the ties people have to their loved ones can never be broken, not even by death. God sends his messengers in many forms, including, for me, the sign of the dove. Ooh, what a compelling story. So, my dears, those were the stories of miracles and mysterious visitors for today. I hope you enjoyed them. It's good to be back with you today, and I'll try to do a couple more stories this month before the month of May is over. And I hope you are enjoying your spring with family and friends and whatever you're doing. And I want you all to take care and stay well. And may God bless. Until next time, this is Natalie Silva with Life Treasures and Golden Moments. Take care, my friends.